Sir.
Wonderful.
Can you do it sideways, sir?
No.
Okay, hello. Well, with much sellotape, with much toing and froing, we've given up on computers. We're now purely relying on someone's cracked iPhone for this. This is Alex Wodak and I'm Fiona Patton. So, Alex, we've just had the medically supervised injecting room open in North Richmond. A battle that you have been fighting since the 1990s. What do you think about some of the opposition that we're now hearing, and also about what do you think about what it's been like since it's been opened?
Well, firstly, it was a very long and a very difficult battle, and many people contributed to that victory. And we'll never know all the people who contributed to it. In a way, that's a shame, but in a way what really matters, I think, is where we go from here.
Yes.
And you were one of the people who certainly made a very valuable, very important contribution. But I think, for me, the big questions now are how many more MSIRs do we need and does Victoria need? Where should they be? How do you decide where they should be? And how do you battle to get them much faster than we were successful first time round? From what I'm seeing, the medically supervised injecting room in Melbourne has been very successful in its first 10 days or so, and yet it's come in for a huge amount of criticism, unjustified criticism, but nevertheless criticism and attack. Unfortunately, the opposition leader is part of that attack. And I don't enjoy saying this, Fiona, and you probably won't enjoy hearing it, but I think you're going to face those attacks and criticism for years to come, based on what happened in Sydney, based on what happened in Vancouver. That's what we're stuck with. And I think...
And that makes it really hard to look at opening another. It makes government so incredibly nervous. I mean, we know how gun-shy they were this time round when the community wanted it. Every single expert, including people like the AMA, we certainly had all of the ambulance organisations and
the police.
And the police. So we had all of those organisations on board. But yes, I think you're right. You know, the minute it opened, everyone said, well, they'll just want to be opening one at a school near you.
Well, we have to remember two things. We have to remember that the need for these medically supervised injecting rooms is great, and unfortunately, like it or not, it's growing in Australia. That need is growing. Second thing, we have to remember that the evidence for medically supervised injecting rooms around the world is overwhelming now. You can't really debate that they don't work. Of course they work. They have health benefits, they have social benefits, they benefit the local community. You don't need them everywhere. We don't need a medically supervised injecting room in Toorak or in Brighton, but certainly needed one in North Richmond. And there are two things we have to take into account: what the need is and what the community response is. Yeah. And unless they're both positive, forget about it.
Forget about it.
If the need is great, but the community doesn't want it there, you can't proceed. You can't ignore the community's response. Clearly, North Richmond wanted one. Clearly, King's Cross, 2 decades ago, wanted one very badly. And I bet you that if there was polling available, and probably there is, it'll be very, very positive, and it will get more positive.
Yeah. And I think someone has actually sent a question about that, like, why can't we have one in South Melbourne or in that region? And certainly when we were looking at the evidence that the coroner provided for us, the overdose deaths in that Port Phillip Bay area were nearly as great as they were in that North Richmond area, with the one exception, and I think this is something that also can be likened to Vancouver, was that they weren't on the street overdoses. They were in rooming houses, and they were where people are alone. And I know Vancouver has taken a much more intensive outreach program to those rooming houses to assist in preventing those overdoses.
Well, North Richmond is obviously not a very prosperous community, and as you know, we've both seen the centre in Vancouver, Insight, the first one they established, and that's also it's the poorest postcode in Canada. And, you know, this is something we try to ignore as hard as we can and pretend that drug addiction's a brain disease, or some people claim that. Load of codswallop, if you ask me, but let's...
Or lack of discipline.
Yeah, or a morality problem or something, but let's not forget the very close connection with poverty and people going through trauma and hard times. So, yes, I think Victoria needs 3, 4, 5 at least. I haven't lived here for a while. It's not for me to decide where they should be, but I think we should start talking about the process of trying to identify where the next ones ought to go. They ought to go where there are concentration of fatal overdoses, concentration of non-fatal overdoses, lots of HIV and hepatitis C notifications, lots of drug-related arrests, high methadone notification. So it's fairly obvious those things tend to cluster. You don't have one of those sets of data over here and another set over somewhere else. They tend to be in the same kind of area, and really they reflect the size of the drug market.
Yes.
And so where there are big drug markets spilling out into the community, that's where you need a medically supervised injecting room. And then sometimes the community is dead against a facility like this. We have to accept that. But in the case of Richmond and King's Cross, they wanted it very badly. And the politicians, I think, have to show some leadership, as they did in Victoria last year, as they did in New South Wales eventually, and lead the community to getting what it needs, what it wants.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, it's an interesting segue for me in looking at drug testing, and I know that you had an important role to play in the establishment of the ACT trial of grooving in the moo, and the reason I'm saying the segue is our drug market. Now, I was really surprised by the results from that grooving in the moo pill testing, to the number of adulterated substances that were found, because in the UK in the Loop model, and when we were looking at it over there, it was like 10. I think there was a 10% that the product was adulterated or it wasn't what the person thought they had bought. But in the ACT model, it was significantly higher.
Well, I think it's partly a reflection of the restrictions that unfortunately the ACT model had to go through, and I think in future we're going to have less restrictions as time goes by, and the pill testing will be more and more valuable. They weren't allowed to advertise their presence. They had all sorts of restrictions imposed on them, and the decision to go ahead was only made just before they actually opened. So it made it very, very difficult for them. Nevertheless, it was a very valuable experience. Well,
that's right. And I think just what really struck me was that the number of products that weren't what the consumer thought they had, and it makes me wonder about our drug market when we and particularly when we think of things like fentanyl coming onto the market. That we have some of the most expensive drugs in the world, but it would appear that we have some of the lowest quality drugs in the world.
I think that's partly a feature of the fact that we're dealing with unregulated markets. Now, a couple of things about this. I think one of the things that's hasn't yet played out in Australia but will in the next days and weeks is the decision by the government in the United Kingdom to not stand in the way of pill testing.
Yes.
That's just
Hurrah.
Yes. And it's going to be harder and harder for the politicians who stand in the way of pill testing to keep up a pretense that they're actually being reasonable. They're being totally unreasonable. This is just being obstinate, obdurate. Of course we need pill testing, and the sooner the better. And I don't really know why we have to have trials, but that's unfortunately we're stuck with that. And we need the ACT to move ahead with legislation to allow future pill testing, and it needs to become the new normal.
Absolutely, and I think when you found in the UK and in speaking to the advocates there, particularly the Loop, that some of the festivals now, if they have this type of harm minimisation practices, it affects their insurance levies.
Well, I'd like somebody to name for me, maybe you can do this, Fiona, name some kind of good or service where the consumer is better protected, is safer by the lack of any regulation. I mean, it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. And, and I think fantastic for the UK moving ahead on this. And, then recently seeing Canada legalise the recreational sale or adult. I'd like to call it the adult use of cannabis. That and setting up a regulated market, which, as they say, first and foremost, it was actually about protecting children and keeping the product out of children's hands. Secondly, keeping it out of criminals' hands.
Well, who could argue with that?
Yeah, that's right.
For me, always the starting point was the decision that was made to criminalise cannabis a reasonable one? And the answer is it wasn't. It wasn't based on any evidence. It was something that people thought was a good idea at the time. There was nothing more to it than that. And once the mistake was made, it's taken us decades and decades and decades of arguing to come to the point now where people are really starting to move. So Canada, October 2018, will be changing. New Zealand will have the referendum in 2020. Uruguay's already started.
Yeah.
And you can see that Lebanon is talking about producing cannabis for the world market. What's stopping change in Australia?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, Fiona, you're the politician. You tell me.
And I find this really curious, and I must say that, even with the supervised injecting centre, even though that privately the majority of politicians are sensible and they do care, but there is this perception, and I think it's around the morality of pleasure sometimes, that there's this perception that the community won't support these types of laws, but that doesn't even bear out. Like, we know that they do support it.
Well, I think bad policy has been good politics for a long time, and we're now coming to the end of that era, at least for drug policy. And bad policy is now starting to be bad politics.
Yes.
And good policy is starting to be good politics. Some politicians realise that, and some politicians don't realise that. And for me, that's the nub of the problem. I think there are two factors in all of this. One is that the political forces that have up till now have sustained bad policy, but the other force is the huge market forces, the very powerful market forces that go on. The illicit drug market is probably worth around about $400 billion. This is the global market a year. So that's about half of the size of the global cigarette market. So that's about a third of the $400 billion, about a third of the Australian economy. So there's a lot of force in that. and that's undermined the politics. So the politics has been pushing towards prohibition, and the economics has been undermining the politics.
And that's an interesting point, because you once raised at a discussion that we were both involved in, that it will be the economics quite often that will win over some of the conservatives.
Yes.
That it makes sense from a dollar perspective, that it makes sense that it's cheaper, or we can get that much needed tax revenue through regulation and legislation.
Well, I think people from different parts of the political spectrum see things different ways, and people on the centre-right tend to see they're horrified. Many of them are horrified by the waste of government money.
Yeah.
Many of them are horrified by the incursions into personal autonomy. And on the centre-left side of politics, I think many are horrified by the social injustice, because, let's face it, the criminal justice, the hand of the criminal justice system always falls harder on the poorer and more disadvantaged members of the population. So there's something in it for everybody.
That's right.
And what you understand very well, and very few politicians seem to, is that there's also huge political advantage to be had, in the sense that if you're a politician and you want the youth vote, and you really want to hang on to the youth vote, here's money for jam.
Yeah.
And if they vote for you in 2019 or 2018 in your case,
yes,
in November, they'll probably vote for you again in 2022 and then in 2026. So I'm amazed that the major parties haven't yet realised that.
Yeah.
Are they asleep at the wheel? I don't know, but certainly around the world, almost on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis, we're seeing one major drug law reform commitment coming out after another. I watch this very closely, as you do, and you can see that really it's just astonishing. And we know that it's not going to be linear. They're going to be, it's going to be zigzag, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. We have to accept that. We know that it's not going to be fast. It's going to be a battle, but it's certainly happening.
Yes, and I think it's an interesting area, because there's the personal freedom argument, and I think it's a very strong one, and that's one that young people certainly will advocate on. You know, we know that the nightmare kind of stories that people tell about drug use, when young people find that that's just not true, you know, we lose them in a whole bunch of areas. But it's the harm minimisation also, that the economics effect that we know that of the needle syringe program, that it was $1 spent on needle syringe programs was $10 saved. $10?
It was $4 in healthcare costs and $27 overall.
Yeah.
And that was a study that the Department of Health commissioned, was done by independent researchers. So it's pretty powerful.
Yeah. And I know in... we've got a question. Sorry, David.
We've got a question from Mark. You mentioned needle syringe programs. What are your thoughts on needle syringe programs in prisons?
Fiona, do you want to...
Well, it's certainly somewhere. I think it's a no-brainer. And what we saw in the drug law reform report is that we had great difficulty bringing the whole committee across the line to recommend needle syringe programs. What we did manage as a sort of a consolation to that was that we requested that records data be kept on the bloodborne virus status of prisoners going into prison and prisoners coming out of prison. We provide them with the hepatitis C virus treatment, which is incredibly effective in prisons, but we're finding prisoners becoming reinfected in prison after undertaking that program. I would love to see it. My understanding at the moment is that it's the unions that have a fear of this, which, as we know, is not upheld. And certainly I know you've been to Switzerland, where it's the unions actually in some cases insist on it. Well,
there's a very important philosophical aspect to this as well, and that that should be deeply entrenched across all the politics, but unfortunately isn't, and that is that people get sent to prison as punishment, not for punishment.
Yeah.
And really, once you realise how important that is, it really means that the healthcare, both prevention and treatment, should be the same high standard in the community and in the prisons. It shouldn't be any difference. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. The only exception that can be made for that is prisons are difficult environments if the healthcare undermines the security of the prison. Well, we know that needle syringe programs operate well in about almost a dozen countries around the world. There hasn't been a problem running them. It hasn't undermined the security of the prison. So I think that's a fundamental strength. The other side of this, for me, is always the reality test. And the reality test is we've been trying for 20 years to get needle syringe programs set up in prisons. And it's been a difficult battle. We haven't made any progress. If you can't make progress in that area, is there anything else you can do? And yes, there is. And I think instead of having 3,000 prisoners, I think you've got in Victoria.
And growing.
Well, let's cap that at 3,000 and start shrinking that population.
Yeah.
Because if you've got a problem and you can't remove that problem from the prison population in Victoria, then at least expose a smaller population to that risk.
Yes.
So if we only had 1,000 prison inmates in Victoria instead of 3,000, well, that wouldn't be quite as good as having a needle syringe program in prison, but it'd be a start.
That's right. I think that was that's certainly. And when you look at the cost of sending someone to prison, and the absolute failure of the prison system to reduce crime in our community, and recently in Victoria, the Ombudsman has just come out with a report saying, "You're not listening to me. You're putting more people in jail. Your reoffending rates are still growing. So what you're doing is not the solution, and you need to change." And I think certainly we know that providing rehabilitation and treatment outside jail systems through community sentencing actually has a far higher rate of success. We know that.
And we've got successful models, the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, where they have a different approach, much more successful, much cheaper, more effective. So it's not as though we don't have different models. Even the United States is now, their prison population's been declining now for 9 years. It hasn't declined much. They reached 715 per 100,000. We're at about 150 per 100,000 across the whole of Australia. So we're only at about a fifth of what the United States is, but going up in the United States is coming down. And in the United States, it's the whole political spectrum, the left and the right, understand the need to they understand how ridiculous it is. We have to win that debate, and I think the only way this is going to happen in Australia, that is shrinking the prison population, is if the whole political system as one unites and decides this is what we're going to do, we're going to cross the line together.
Yeah.
That's where we've got to go. And you, as a person who's outside the major parties, could play a critical role in that, and I hope you do.
Yes, I hope I do too, and it certainly will be a strong part, because law and order always takes on a very headline role in elections, and we will, in our policy platform, make it a headline for us, but we will be presenting very different solutions that are backed by the evidence and the research, and the fact that even conservative states like Texas are recognising that the rotating door, the warehousing of prisoners, does not treat the underlying issues of offending, and that there are far more successful ways to make our community safer and to reduce the level of reoffending.
And many prisoners have young children.
Yep.
It's damaging future generations. Now, we can't get rid of prisons. We'll always have prisons. But I think there's a debate that we really need to have in Australia. Does Victoria really need to have 3,000 and going up numbers of prisoners? Could you do just as well with 1,000?
Well, when you look at the figures, and I think the latest report acknowledged that over 60% of our prisoners have mental health issues. So, I suppose instead of building mental health facilities, we're building prisons, and that is very disappointing. Just on a final, did you want? I was going to say just on a final thing. If there was one policy, or there was one legislative change that the Victorian government could or should make, what do you think it should be? If you could choose one,
scrap all penalties for personal possession and use of all currently illicit drugs.
Yeah.
Don't do that tomorrow. Do it yesterday.
Fantastic. And recommendation 13 of the Drug Law Reform Report doesn't go that far, but certainly that is the intent of it.
Kobe asks, do you see major rural cities being part of a safe injecting trial?
Hi, Kobe.
Well, it's a great question.
Yeah.
And the difficulty is that I think in order for these things to have a reasonable sense of cost effectiveness, the question of scale comes up. And it's easy to get scale, whether we like it or not. It's easy to get scale in Richmond or in King's Cross, but by the time you get to
Ballarat
or Bendigo, it's much more difficult. And I think we have to think of different models. I'm sure this question's been asked around the world. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's something we need to look at.
I think it goes back also to that your basis for where those facilities are located is community support for it and obvious need for it. Great.
In terms of recent policy moves on cannabis and school sniffer dogs in South Australia, has there been lobbying on this in Victoria? Do you know if you know?
Not to the same degree as South Australia. I mean, I don't know what century their Attorney General has come from, but she's a time traveller, and it's from the past, not the future. Her policies around sniffer dogs, and I do note that it's only in public schools. It's not in the private or grammar schools. So this is not the answer, and we know this, that we know that trying to punish young people around their drug use actually does not assist in making them safe and ensuring that we have that we can give them adequate information, adequate education, and the like. So no, I haven't heard it here. We haven't seen the same level of sniffer dogs in Victoria actually as we have seen in New South Wales, and
my understanding is that the proposals in South Australia that the government has put forward haven't got a chance of getting through the upper house. You'd have a better handle on that than me, but I suspect that the government must have known that before they put them forward, and I suspect that it's some kind of political ploy.
Yeah.
It's some kind of a stunt to distract attention from some cock-up, or it's throwing red meat to the political base, or it's something of that kind. It's not really a serious political strategy. And the whole world is now going down the path of working out how to get out of this mess we're in, where we've got a drug policy that clearly doesn't work.
Yeah. And I think we probably should wrap up soon, but I think one of the wonderful outcomes of the Portuguese model, and while not painting it, this sort of 100% glowing image of the system, it's very good. But one of the most amazing things, I think, is the age of the time when people first take drugs has increased in Portugal. And it's probably one of the only jurisdictions in the world where people are trying drugs later. And we know that one of the one of the indicators for problematic drug use in the future is the age in which you started using drugs. So, you know, if we start looking at that and we start looking at the resilience of our young people, not, you know, sending in the dogs, I think we will have a much more successful outcome.
One of the things that's never stressed about Portugal, and it's critical to the success of the reforms that they introduced in 2001, is the expansion and improvement of their drug treatment system. They were very lucky to have a very able doctor in charge of that, Dr. Schwalbelau, and he has done a wonderful job expanding and improving their system. And if we're serious about drug law reform, harm reduction in Australia, that's got to be a central plank of what we do here as well.
And I think what I loved about there is that, you know, it wasn't sort of, you know, we'll get you onto methadone and methadone for life. It was about, we then start occupational therapy, we then start introducing ways to reconnect with family, we then start looking at reconnecting you into employment. And it was a very nuanced and tertiary approach to rehabilitation.
And you find in most parts of Europe now, Western Europe now, you find a much more emphasis on the social factors, rightly so. I don't have a problem with that. I'm very strongly supportive. So it's not just seen as a health issue, certainly not seen anymore as a criminal justice issue, seen as a health and a social issue. That's where we have to end up in Australia, and the sooner the better.
Well, on that note, thank you, Alex.
My pleasure.
This has been great. Thanks for being around our first live Facebook.